Welcome to the seminar entitled The Initiatic Mysteries of Classical Antiquity. This first module will introduce you to all the precursors of the mystery traditions, the initiatic mystery cults, beginning with the Osirian and through the Eleusinian, the oracular mysteries, the Mithraic mysteries, the later Icean mysteries, the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. In order to understand them, we have to understand something about the ancient shamanic and spiritual consciousness that prepared the ground for these to eventually develop. And there are different stages of human spiritual consciousness we need to look at. Now, human history is divided in legend and myth into certain kinds of eras, the first of which being the era of creation or the first man. And very often these stories are cast in such a way that they begin 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era. For example, in the Old Testament, the story of the creation of Adam. Greek mythology tells us of a golden age when the first human being was created. Other cultures refer to a similar time, a time of paradise in Eden. After this, in the Greek mythological scheme of things, comes what's called the Silver Age, a time which in other cultures is a time of the great patriarchs and founders and the first shamans for the spiritual traditions of their cultures and so on. The Greeks then refer to a Bronze Age, a time of their heroes, and in other cultures, very often a time of heroes and great ancestors. And then they refer to the current age, which is the Iron Age. Now, this current age in Greek and many other schemes of mythology from other cultures is an inferior age. The current age is a time when the gods do not act as they have in the past and act in history. It's an evil age, and human beings are lesser and inferior to the great human beings of an earlier age, and so on. This is a painting of the mythological story of the creation of the first man. On behalf of Zeus, Athena works with Prometheus to create a model of the human body, and into that body she induces a soul, a psyche, and that is the creation of the first human being in the Golden Age. We're not going to use the Greek or the Hebrew or other distinctions of these ages of humanity. We're going to use the astronomical ages that are determined by the precession of the equinox and that are very important to the ancient cultures. There's a Taurian period, an Aryan period. We're currently in the Piscean period, the age of Pisces, and coming into the Aquarian period. And these very nicely relate to the stages of human spiritual consciousness related especially to the mysteries. Now, if we look at a chart of the zodiac, we can look at the sign of Taurus. In the sign of Taurus, the first degree of Taurus was where the sun was resident at the time of spring, the spring equinox, when the sun has risen exactly midway between its farthest southern position in the winter and its farthest northern position in the summer. And we call this whole period of time that's ruled by this the Taurian period. This lasts from about 5,000 years before the Christian era to about 2,500 years or 2,300 years, something like that. The Aryan period, when the equinoxes have precessed and now people are determining the date of spring by the appearance of the sun in the first degree of the constellation of Aries. This is the period of time that the great mystery cults and religions begin to arise, and that's the period of time that is the time of classical antiquity. And that period gives way to the period of the Piscean era, the era of Pisces, and the Christian era. And the distinction between that time and the Piscean time and what happens to human spirituality is something we're going to take note of, plus even some speculations about what may happen as we transit into another great era of human spirituality, the Aquarian age. Now, as we consider the evolution of human spiritual consciousness, we begin back in the Taurian age, the age of Taurus. Now, remember that humanity has come through quite a crisis, the Great Ice Age that extended from about 20,000 to 10,000 BCE. And this was something that was a great crisis for our species, because our particular species of humanity, Homo sapiens, had only been on the earth for perhaps 40 to 60,000 years, and it was a great challenge to us to survive the tremendous cold of the Ice Age. And we did so because our species has a great deal of skill and intelligence. Others did not survive. Sometime before the Ice Age came about, the Neanderthals had been assimilated or disappeared. Homo habilis was no longer here. Homo erectus had become extinct. So our species was the species that had made it through the Ice Age. And after the great period of trial in the Ice Age, people came out, the climate warmed, and people were able to start living nomadically and following groups of animals, and eventually founding cities. And some of the oldest cities that we know of are founded after the Ice Age, cities like Jericho. Now, in the Taurian age, the age of Taurus, is about the time that we know people are making astronomical measurements. We date that from about 4150 to 2100 years before the Christian era. And in that period, there is a very different form of social structure than we have today. It was matrilinear. Basically, it was what some people have, Eisen has called in many places, a partnership kind of culture, where there was no patriarch, there were no wars, there were no serious conflicts of large battles. The mothers were the centers of the families, and the gods were not gods, they were goddesses, most of them. Also, the emphasis upon divine contact was found in the underworld, the divine underworld, beneath the world, in caves, beneath the volcanoes. This contact with this form of the divine world, which may seem a little strange to us, is called chthonic. It's a contact with an underworld that leads us to where we perhaps descend in our dreams, leads us to make contact with our ancestors and our dead parents and so on. And there are many of the mythic components and storytelling components of this period are accessible to us in the later myths that we have of the Greeks and so on. Most cultures at this time were still nomadic. There were a few cities, but women had discovered and invented agriculture. They had made the observations. They were the ones who hunted, and rather not hunted, but gathered berries and nuts and things like this. And they had been the ones who discovered the process through which plants germinate and generate. And they had also begun to make, to tame and make pets and even domesticate animals, wild animals. Some of the oldest animals that were domesticated even as pets, we have found from many decades even before this. We have found in graves of people, their pets, but also the animals that they used for milking and for having eggs and things like this. So it was more of a nomadic rather than an agricultural kind of setting, but it was moving into city building and agricultural civilization. The word civis means the city. And civilization is building a culture and city where you live in one place instead of having to follow the herds through the seasons. You live in one place, and there you are able to sustain life because you can domesticate animals, and you learn how reproduction happens. Now, this time in history, believe it or not, human beings did not know how babies were made. Women finally began to discover how this was done, but we have Greek myths that tell us, for example, in this time, that it was thought that women became pregnant by having their bare buttocks aimed at the south wind, or by eating too many beans. But women did discover how animals propagated, and eventually it was understood that that's how humans propagated. It's a little difficult when you perform an act, a sexual act, and then 9 months later the baby comes out. It'd be sort of like turning off the switch in your light switch and then waiting 9 months for the light to go off. It'd be pretty hard to make a causal connection between those two things. But women were the ones who were actually the first, we might say, scientists. They discovered a lot of these causal connections. And later on, the great inventions of science and agriculture will be attributed to goddesses. Many settlements occur in the bronze and in this period of time, and men, in their kinds of investigation, discover how to use metals, not just stone. So we're in the late Neolithic or Stone Age period, and so we have the introduction of the Bronze Age and the use of copper, which is a sort of greenish material, malachite and other things that will melt rather easily around a campfire and can then be recast into implements. And then if the copper is taken and made into an alloy with tin and some other things that melt at rather low temperatures, you can make a pretty hard and solid weapon. Now, after the age of Taurus, we have what we call the age of Aries. That's about 2000 BC until the end of the ancient time period, about 2,000 years. And here we now have a very different change. We have gone from matriarchal and partnership cultures to patriarchal cultures. Although there are many, many important aspects of matriarchy that still remain. Gods are developed from being the gods of the underworld and below the sea to the sky gods, gods in the mountains, and temples are now made up in the mountains, not just down in the caves. And this is the time of the development of the initiatic mystery religions. Men develop warfare, slavery, trade, writing, which is developed basically for commerce. City-states begin to be ruled, and peaceful civilizations, agricultural civilizations, are invaded and taken over by male warlords, and the ancient nations begin to arise. And it is at this time that a hotter kind of fire can be made by using bellows, and the Phoenicians developed this. They're later known as the Philistines in the Old Testament. And they learn how to make an even more powerful metal, something more powerful than bronze that we call iron. And Phoenicians, driven out of their homelands, come over as traders in boatloads of perhaps 50 and are able to conquer Egyptian armies of hundreds with their superior Iron Age weapons, because an iron sword will literally shatter a bronze shield or a bronze sword. Now, we are all familiar with the Piscean age, the age of Pisces, which is really the modern period that begins about the time of the development of Christianity and extends up into the modern world. As a matter of fact, the age of Pisces technically does not end at the year 2000 of the Christian era, probably somewhere around 2100 or something like that. But this is the age where patriarchy triumphs, the age that is dominated by male power and male leadership. And this is the era where the world's ancient nations become political forces, develop from the Hellenistic kingdoms into the later kingdoms of Europe, and the world religions develop around these cultures. And now we have the development, we've moved from the caves to the mountains, now we have the creation of our own artificial mountains in the great cathedrals and mosques and things that are built. And nations conquer other nations, and warfare from nation to nation, ruled by male kings and their queens. World settlement, the development of science and technology, all this characterizes this age of Pisces, the Piscean age. We are moving into a new age, a new spiritual age of mankind, known as the age of Aquarius, the Aquarian age. And indications seem to be that at least the more spiritually evolved elements of humanity are moving away from patriarchy into, not back into old matriarchy, but into a form of partnership between male and female. Women are now becoming heads of state. And there seems to be a new interest in spiritual development of the individual, the initiatic schools and individual spirituality in nature, cults and religions, and Wicca is a very interesting kind of development where we have a male and female god, and so on. We have a global culture that seems to be developing. And we have technology to start cleaning up the mess we've been making. Ecological technology, hopefully to clean up the oceans and the air. Spiritual technology, so that we can develop and progress on the inner levels and the inner worlds that we have not yet looked at. Perhaps extraterrestrial settlement. So in the context of those four general spiritual divisions of what men and women are and what humanity is, what the relationship between men and women has been and may become, and the relationship of individuals to their nations and to their own souls, let's take a look at the evolution of what we call initiation. What is initiation? Initiation is the bringing of a person into a higher estate in which he is or she is a member of a brotherhood or sisterhood that has resources and human resources and spiritual resources that go beyond what might exist. In the ancient world, this was simply initiation into tribal full adulthood in a tribe. It was puberty rites. This kind of initiation is still practiced in Africa and tribes and New Zealand and places like this. In the ancient world, it was the gateway to adulthood. It was the initiation into manhood for a young man. And there were also rituals for women that were done a little differently. It becomes forms of that we might think of as mutilation. For example, circumcision. Circumcision in modern African tribes that are still following the customs of their ancestors for young men takes place at the age of about 12. And this is very painful, and it's a real trial by fire to make go through the gateway from childhood to adulthood and adulthood responsibility. But in the Hebrew religion, in Judaism, circumcision was done when children were born, when they were 8 days old. And that was a much more humane way of doing this kind of mutilation, which I don't think is really necessary medically or for any other reason. There are also tribes and groups that circumcise women, in fact, even cut out their clitorises so they cannot have a sexual pleasure, and so they can be subjugated more easily, etc. But ancient initiation, tribal initiation, was a recognition that someone had earned the right to become a full adult in a tribe. So initiation was basically the first step into full adult responsibility, the right to marry, to breed children, to become a warrior, to become a wife, etc. And those were done in very specific ways, using very specific ceremonies. During the Taurian period, initiation became something much more. The introduction of what today we call shamanism, actually the term shaman is simply the name of a certain Southeast Asian priest or holy man. It's not a general term, but it's been made into a general term by anthropologists. So now we refer to all priests and holy men, etc., as shamans. But Taurian period spirituality developed specialists in working with the spirits of the ancestors and with the spirits that rule the world and the elements, and with the deities that could be addressed. And although there had always been shamaning as a part of ancient consciousness far before the time of the Great Ice Age, in the Taurian period, shamanic initiation became initiation into more than simply contact with the ancestors. It was initiation into the spirit world and to the powers of the spirit world for the benefit of the tribe, and it became a special kind of vocation. And by the time of the Taurian period, that vocation was being specialized into what we would think of as priesthood. And now, this is the time, by the way, in Greek spiritual history where the God of all, the God of all things, was known as Pan. Not necessarily, by the way, a masculine word or a masculine concept, but it simply meant all. It's part of what we call the old religion. And in about this period of time, we start to see the development of iconography that shows us this horned god, Pan. And at this time, shamans have been wearing animal skins and taking on animal powers through totemistic initiation and learning the powers of their particular totem animal. It might be the bear, it might be the wolf, or in Egypt it might be Neptunus, the crocodile, or other kinds of animals. And they would wear the skins of these animals, and these animals would be taboo to kill, but they would once a year be sacrificed, and their blood would be drunk, and the power of the animal, which was the protector of the tribe or the group, would be drunk by the priests and so on, or they would bathe themselves in it, whatever. And this is the beginning of the time where we have training and initiation of priests, and very often priest kings. The term Melchizedek in the Old Testament refers to a very ancient form of Semitic priest king. He's a sheikh. He is someone who is the head of his entire group of wandering culture. And he's called the king of righteousness, Melchizedek. And he is considered to be a priest of the Most High God, who would be El Elyon, but is not even named as Yahweh. And so we find even survivals of this in the Old Testament, and survivals of the training of a priest king, and priests and priestesses. And we find this being done in Egypt, and we find it later on, some of this as a part of the training of rulers in Egypt who undergo the Eleusinian mysteries and so on. Here is a photograph of a priest being ordained, so to speak, in Santeria, which is a Cuban magical and shamanic form of religion. He's been through extensive training that goes for many years in order to receive this ceremony. We still do the same thing today. You want to be a priest in the Episcopal Church, you go to theological seminary and you train and you apprentice and all that sort of thing. And it's at this time, in the Taurian period, that this kind of initiation, the initiation of the shaman or the holy man, is the culmination of a long period of training. And very often, the shaman or holy man was in fact a king and a warrior king. Now we come to the Aryan period, about 2000 BC up into the first few centuries of Christianity. Here we have a change. We're changing over from the priesthood that is initiating new priests, for example, the Osirian mysteries of the Egyptian forms of government and religion, to a new kind, the kind that we call the mystery schools or the mystery cults or the mystery religions. Most well-known of them being the Eleusinian mysteries, the mysteries that were practiced at Eleusis. And here, we're no longer initiating people into priesthood. It becomes, as St. Paul would say, a kind of priesthood of the laity or of the people. We are initiating people who are found to be moral and worthy people and nominated by other initiates into a very high form of spirituality, which involves spiritual and moral discipline. And this brings us into the Eleusinian mysteries, the Pythagorean, the Mithraic, the Jewish Christian mysteries, etc. So this is a whole new kind of thing. Initiation into the mystery religions and mystery cults becomes an initiation of people who are considered to be worthy people, more qualified people, people who other initiates consider to be worthy to invite and train. And they go through a period of training, sometimes a very long period of training. This is one of the wall paintings at the Mystery House, at the Mystery Via in Pompeii. It's part of an initiatic mystery ceremony, we think probably for the initiation of young girls into the all the mysteries of human marriage and motherhood. So, as you can see, the origins of the period of time we're going to be talking about, the time of the mystery religions, the mystery and initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity, have their roots in shamanic practices and shamanic institutions, and shamanic institutions and practices have their roots in totemism and the understanding of the relationship between the human and the divine is coming through animals and through the powers and magical forces that animals represent. So Egypt is a wonderful place to start understanding this sort of thing because it's the land of the gods who have animal heads. What are they? They're masks that are worn by the priests. Totem masks, masks of animals. But we no longer have totemism as we had in a tribal sense. We now have a very highly refined and civilized form of it with much myth and much intellect going about. So we've come from a kind of nomadic wandering hunter dressed up in a bear suit to priests and priesthoods wearing far more abstract kinds of clothing and with far more intelligent and abstruse ways of understanding what they're doing spiritually. Here is the human-headed, lion-bodied sphinx that guards one of the places of initiation in Memphis. Now, we have to respect the animal connection because it's through the animals and through the powers of the animals that people understood that which was divine and the forces of nature and the powers in nature. Totemism is, in fact, the great connection for especially not just males, but for females as well, because women had tamed the animals. Here we have a representation of Anubis, the holding a was wand, the priest. But it's not just the Egyptians that have their roots in this sort of animistic thing. If we look, for example, at the seraphim and the cherubim that surround the throne of God, that were portrayed in the Temple of Jerusalem, one on each side of the altar. Here is a fanciful drawing, but these are, the seraphim are fire snakes, fire serpents, that guard the throne and that are powerful beings. And the cherubim are the divine animals, the eagle and the ox and so on, that guard the throne. These are the animals that are seen by Ezekiel and others of those who are riders of the chariot, the Merkaba mystics who ascend to the throne of God. So the roots are still shamanic. Now, in the Taurian and Aryan periods, as we move from in the last few thousand years, that bring us into the period of the mystery religions of classical antiquity, the shaman was a mediator. He was a highly specialized mediator, then in some systems became a priest or a high priest or whatever it might be, depending upon how organized the system was, between human beings and the transcendent spirit world, which could involve communications of the ascended pharaoh through his Ka, or could have involved communications with ancestors through dreams or through descent into the divine underworld, etc. So at this point, this was the basic function of priesthood, was to connect humanity with the invisible divine world of spirit. Now, in order to understand what this is all about, we have to understand what a god was. And we're going to look especially at what a god and gods and God were in the ancient period, and then see how this was eventually developed among the Greeks, because the Greeks were the first people to have gods with human bodies and human faces. A god is in Greece, and in Greek language, a theos, which means a setter of boundaries or limits, a lawgiver. The images that we are using are taken from the website of Sacred Source, where you can purchase these images. If you're interested in images of the divine, especially shamanic and goddess images, this is an excellent site. They've got good scholarship and they've got wonderful images. If we go back to see what were the oldest gods, the oldest gods we've been able to discover are several 100,000 years old, and they belong actually to a different species of human being than we are, probably to Homo habilis or Homo erectus, from around anywhere from 200 to 500,000 or 600,000 years ago. This is the oldest image we have of a deity, and feminists will tell you it's a woman with breasts, and it's a Mother Earth goddess. And I don't think that that's all that's there. I think that they will also see that it is phallic. It's hermaphroditic. It's both a female and a male representation of a god, and God as connected to fertility, because the most important thing for people was for there to be fertility in their tribes and in their families and among their domestic animals. Here is probably the most ancient form of the mother goddess. This dates from 20 or 30,000 years ago, and it's a very, very exaggerated feminine figure with very large breasts, and the legs are positioned in such a way that they could be stuck into something in clay so that they could be put up on some kind of an altar or something like this. Well, what we're looking at here is the Achillean image, which dates between 230,000 and 800,000 years ago. And if we take a look at this this little representation of history, the earliest proto-humans, they tell us, are about 2 million years ago. In fact, they're about 6 million years ago, the earliest hominids. But this first thing we looked at that looks like a combination of a phallus and a female goddess is from 230 to 800,000 years ago, belongs to an entirely different species of human being than we are. And then the second one we looked at that definitely looks like a mother goddess is what is known as the Willendorf goddess, and it was seems to have been created about 30,000 years ago. If you take a look at the blow up of the period, you get some idea of how long ago that was. The Common Era begins 2,000 years ago. The Willendorf was created 30,000 years ago. Now let's take a little journey through the images that we have from ancient times, prehistoric times, Taurian times, and Aryan times of gods and goddesses and how they relate to the shaman and the shamaness and the priesthood. This is called the net goddess. It only dates from around 700 BC, but it replicates designs that were from the Cretan Minoan period, a time when there was a partnership or matriarchal type of society. The rectangular net patterns symbolize probably the waters of life, and notice that there are plants and birds on this mother goddess. This representation of an Asherah was made into a loaf of bread. It was part of the spirituality of ancient Canaan and of the ancient Hebrews. The ancient Hebrews worshipped female forms of deity as well as male forms of deity, a father and a mother god. Canaanite and Hebrew women molded loaves of this figure that were blessed and ritually eaten, very much like the Christian communion service or the Mithraic sacred bread and so on. And the Asherah represented a pole or a pillar or a tree that was used in accordance with various kinds of fertility rites. Later on, the patriarchal forces in Hebrew religion, especially through the prophets, were very opposed to the worship of anything feminine, considered to be adulterous infidelity to the religion, and priestly iconoclasts finally uprooted the Asherahs, chopped down the sacred trees, and tried to destroy this. But this continued throughout Hebrew religion into Kabbalistic forms. We find it in the feminine forms of Hebrew religion, still memorialized in really ancient Kabbalistic myths and so on. This is the Great Mother of Malta. Dates back to the time of the goddess temples on Malta, about 3,100 years before the Christian era. That's earlier than the pyramids, and it reflects a highly organized worship of goddess, the goddess of the earth, and the goddess that goes into prehistory. She's upraising her hand in a blessing gesture. This is one of the earliest forms we see of the blessing gesture. Now, we need to talk a little bit about the word idolatry. What is idolatry? Here is an image of a god. This is an image of Zeus. Notice that it has ringlets and curls in its beard and in its hair, etc. There is only one way to make a Zeus, and the better you could make that Zeus, the more powerful it would be, because idolatry was basically the use of imagery to cause a divine power to draw near to people, so it was accessible. Now, we can find by tracing the iconography of and the images of the gods, we can find the interesting, subtle things that weave through history that show the connections of the gods. This is a Greek god. This is the god Osiris or Serapis. He was created by the priesthood when two great regions of Egypt merged. One had as its sacred god Osiris, and the other one Apis, the black bull. And this was made out of a completely black kind of stone, and the figure of Osiris was made to merge these together. And it was a technology done by the priests to literally create a new god. So you have to understand that what a god is and what an idol is and what an image is. It is not a picture of the unknowable, ineffable deity that rules all things. It's a human representation of a force, and a force that can exist in nature or that exists as a composite of the protective ancestors or many other kinds of things. And the best the image could be made, the better it could be made, the more powerful it was. For example, Praxiteles was a great sculptor in the Renaissance and the reviving of Athens. And he could make the best Zeus, and the most powerful, therefore, the most powerful Zeus, the most powerful Athena. And you could come to these statues and draw near to those energies by using the imagery, the power of the imagery. Later on, images would even be given motion to make them even more powerful. Motion was given to Serapis in the Serapean temples by scientists like Hero of Alexandria, who actually created steam engines that would cause the arm to raise up and fire to come out of the mouth and things like this, making even a more perfect representation of the deity. Now, I have to tell you a story of a great athlete so that you can understand what a statue was and how it was understood. A great athlete who lived in a certain village in the Hellenistic period, had defeated all comers in wrestling and everything else that he did, and finally he died. And a statue was erected to him based on his death mask. So it was a very powerful statue, considered to keep the connection with this great athlete. However, one of the challengers that he had conquered, who hated him, came at nighttime with a whip to whip the statue in order to punish him, because he knew that by whipping the statue, he would inflict pain upon the spirit of the great athlete who had departed. However, the statue fell over and killed him. The statue was put on trial because it was considered that the force behind the statue was really what had caused this to happen. And so this great athlete was actually put on trial, even though he was dead. And it was determined that he was guilty of murder. And the sentence was to take the statue out into the Mediterranean and dump it in the sea. And that was done. Well, that particular city experienced drought and famine for 3 years, until finally one of the members of the city council were sent to a great oracle, I believe it was the oracle at Delphi, and asked what they should do to relieve the famine. And the oracle gave this particular judgment. She said, return from exile the one whom you have exiled. And that meant to them they had to go find the statue and put it back in a place of honor. Well, nobody knew how to recover the statue, but serendipitously, over the next year, some fishermen caught the statue in their nets, and they dragged it back to the shore, and they re-erected it upon its pedestal and continued giving it honors. Now, statues were given many honors. They were not only offered food, which was burned for them in the fire and then turned into smoke, but statues were also given clothing. In fact, there were special priests called the stolismai who would dress the statues and the images to honor them and so on. So this whole business of idolatry, we have to understand what it was all about and what a god was. And a god was a force or power that was tied deeply to the power and the genetic power and the family power and the ancestor power of any group of people. And it was represented as a being who might have had children or procreated or had other mythical relationships that created or helped establish the town or the city or the tribe. So the psychology of ancient people in the Taurian and the Aryan world was very different than it is today. personality was collective. One's identity was as part of something. One was part of a group, part of a tribe. And so we have what we call collective personality. Collective personality meant that the leaders, or the divine leaders of a culture, were the cult. For example, here are images of the pharaoh. Pharaoh, you'll notice, is portrayed as much bigger than any of the other people. In this one on the left, he's conquered a lesser king, and so he is ruling over that king and subjecting him, but that king is much larger than other human beings. On the right, we see images of the pharaoh as a very large and tall figure, and then smaller people who are represent the court, and then even smaller people who represent the normal laity and the people of the land, and so on. The stories that were not written about common everyday people. They were pharaoh stories. If you wanted to tell your child a story at night, you told him a story about the pharaoh. So in this consciousness, human beings were part of a larger collective group led by divine priests and divine kings. Now, immortality was reserved for these great ones who represented collectively all of Egypt or whatever other group it might have been. And so after death, these ones were given special burial places and special rites by priests. Now in Egypt, these special rites spread out over the centuries from being for just the pharaoh and the pharaoh's family to eventually the relatives of the pharaoh, and eventually any wealthy person who could afford to do this. And that's what the Egyptian books of the dead were developed for. And in Greek history, the great and remarkable people who were called heroes, the word hero among the Greeks meant a remarkable person who had done remarkable things, and therefore it was thought had been the product not just of human birth, but of a combination of sexual congress between a human being and a god, usually a human mother and a male father, although sometimes a human mother and a god as a father, although sometimes the other way around. Within a generation after Plato's death, it was told that he, as a remarkable human being, was a demigod because, or a hero because his mother had intercourse with Zeus, and it was through the intercourse of Zeus and his mother that the great hero Plato was produced. And this was true whether they were philosophers, warriors, or whatever. So immortality was something that belonged to just the greatest of human beings. All the rest of us were consigned to the underground places known as Hades or Sheol. And the heroes would go to these underground places where everyone else went, but they would go to a special place, the Elysian Fields or places like that. Here we have an image of a hero being shown the spirits of all those in the underworld, which is presided over by the king and queen, who are, the king is Hades or Pluto, and his wife is Persephone of the Eleusinian mysteries. Now it is these heroes, these culture heroes, whether they're priest kings or whether they are legendary beings, that themselves, worthy of immortality, open the gates of heaven, open the gates of the higher places in spiritual reality to human beings through establishing the mysteries. And this is a rather general statement, but basically the heroes of Greece and of Egypt and of Asia Minor and so on were often associated with the mystery cults that arose, and it was they who had opened the way and opened the gates for normal people to be trained to become more than normal people, to become people of extremely high ethics, who had learned things of the mysteries and understood deep things. In other words, it was a kind of introduction of people into the shamanic mysteries. Here is an image of Dionysus. Dionysus is a god that appears in Greece long after the Eleusinian mysteries have been established, and actually quite strongly influences the Eleusinian mysteries. And he's not just a god of partying and wine, as a lot of people think. He's a very deep mysteries associated with Dionysius and spiritual transformation of human beings and the opening of the gates of immortality. This is Apollo. Apollo and his lyre. Apollo, who became associated with the Delphic oracular mysteries after the priests of Apollo had subjugated the priestesses of Gaia, who had been giving prophecies from the caves that later became the temple of Apollo for the Delphic oracle. And Apollo established his mysteries by conquering the Pythos, the great serpent, which was associated with the powerful women of the oracular mysteries at that time, as the patriarchy swept in and patriarchal forces took over. And this became, then Apollo became the great god of the Greek patriarchs and the god of rational and philosophical kind of knowledge that led to perfection in the afterlife. This is an image of Hermes Trismegistus, the Hermetic mysteries, mysteries of Thoth and Hermes, who is often known as Thoth Hermes, or Hermes Thoth. From Greek roots and from Egyptian roots, became really important about the time of the rise of early Christianity, and stayed important through the Middle Ages, preserving Pythagorean and other kinds of occult knowledge and opening the way to the Ogdoad, or the eighth heaven. This is Mithra, who is a great sacrificial, dying, and rising god, really kind of an archetype of the Christ, who is the Son of God, so to speak, at the very beginning, cosmically, who establishes the boundaries of heaven and earth through slaying the cosmic bull. And the bull is the sacrificial animal into which whose blood people are baptized in the Torah bullion. The blood of the bull is dripped over them, etc. The bull, however, by the way, is a sacrificial and cultic animal of ancient matriarchal religions, such as in the Cretan Minoan civilization. So much more about this later, but here's another hero of the initiatic mysteries. Now, we have to understand then that there's an ego state among ancient people of not really being individuals the way you and I are individuals today. They see themselves as part of a group, part of a family, and they are part of a culture that they can't really wander out beyond. Law, and the Greek term themis, means that which is established and that which is traditional is the way things ought to be. So things should be the way they have been. Things were very static in a cultural kind of inversion like this, where in order to be righteous and to be right, one had to do what had always been done in the past and worship the gods as they had always been worshipped. When the philosophers came along, or the prophets came along and challenged these ideas, individuality started to be born the way that we have it today. And we find glimpses of it coming along in many ways. But we'll talk about those things later when we talk about the philosophers and so on. But basically, the ego state in the Taurian and the Aryan period is coming from a place of human beings being part of a group and part of a lineage and part of a line to finally becoming full individuals. In the Old Testament, that it is said that God will visit the sins of the fathers upon the children down to the 10th generation, and later on the later prophet says, no, that's not the way it is. Each person is responsible for his own sins from now on. I've got a new message from God telling me this. Or the fact that in the ancient world, if one person raised up a rebellion against a king, the king didn't just execute that person. He executed all of that person's children and wives and uncles and brothers and everyone. not only because there was a lex talionis, because there was a moral duty to carry out vengeance for the killing of anyone of your group or your tribe, and he had to account for that, and that's why he had to wipe out everybody, but also because they were considered to be guilty. The sin of person X went to his whole family and came from that and was part of his seed, etc. So this is the ego state. The relationships between men and women were not at all like they are today. There was romantic love of a sort, and later on, and we see with the myths of Eros and Psyche, and later on as things develop, we find more and more of the kind of relationship between man and woman, the romantic relationship that we think of today, although it's really quite different. It's ruled by forces that are represented by cupids and things like this, that are forces that people have no control over, so that people may fall violently in love with someone who is totally out of their class, or who is extremely younger, extremely older, and so love is considered to be an illness as it finally develops. But initially, the relationship between men and women is that of an owner and its property in the patriarchal period. And women are for property and for breeding, and with exceptions in the higher classes, that's the way it basically was. We also have to understand the idea of sympathy, sympathetic magic. Idolatry is a form of sympathy. If you want to draw near or bring near to you the power and the presence of a deity, you make an image, and that image will, by sympathy, have to be inhabited by the power of that god. If you were to take a photograph of someone in a modern tribe, they would try to get that picture away from you because they know that you could stab pins into the picture and cause them pain. This is the idea of sympathetic magic. And so stone and images were very, very important things, and in all kinds of operations, magical operations, and we have much that has passed down to us from the ancient world about how magical operations were done and how they worked, and they were very effective. They actually did work, and this is all done by the concept we call sympathy, which is the driving concept behind idolatry. Now we're going to take a look at an ancient cauldron, a shamanic cauldron that's associated with shamanic magic. We're going to look at the images on this to understand that the shaman who is represented and who used this bowl for magical purposes, and this was a male shaman, had very deep and close relationships with animals and totem powers. We notice that the animals are not just the animals we would see in the forest. They are mythological animals. They are spirits and powers that come to us through the images of normal animals. We notice that the shaman has paraphernalia, that he uses a certain kind of tools that he holds and he uses for enchanting and other kinds of things. You notice he's wearing horns. He's a horned shaman, and that is part of what relates him to the source of his powers. And you'll notice that the face that we see is probably the face of a deity, the face of the shaman's deity that he appeals to. And we can see that stories are told, for example, on this cauldron, stories that we don't have a clue or any way to understand what they're about, but stories that may have to do with birth, death, and transformation, battles, war scenes, and so on, that the cauldron might have been used for in magical ways. This shamanic cauldron is really the roots of what we think of today as the Holy Grail. Now, the magic of shamans and the development of the ideas of deities and gods who assisted the shamans in magical and spiritual acts are very, very closely related. The shamans dress in horns and in costumes of their totem animals in order to gain the powers of their animals. And we have many, many images that we can look at to give us a better idea of what the relationship is between shamaning and priesthood and connection with the forces of nature. And we're going to look at both male images and female images that existed. Now, these are all images of statuary that are available through the website I've given you above. Now, here are some of the magical gods. Here's a Baal, the lord of the high places, and his name was so well known it was carried across even into Europe. The Irish feast of Beltane and the Norse god Balder are inheritors of this bull-horned deity's potency that comes all the way from the Middle East. He is depicted here on the Rosh Shamra stela from Syria with a thunder club and lightning bolt spear. Often he was represented as an upright stone or a phallic symbol, a lingam. This is an image of Neptune, which is related to the image that will appear in Europe of the green man, the image of male fertility. This is Ammon, the Egyptian ram god, and he assumed the form of a reigning king in order to procreate and to divinify the royal lineage. And here in Egypt, we have a transformation of a horned beast to a horned god that represents the crucial importance of the herdsman and of the fructification of domestic herds and so on in this culture. He was the patron of Thebes, and he spoke through oracles and was equated by the Greeks with Zeus. And there are many other interesting things about this god that are still yet being discovered. This is a representation of a deity, a male deity with a serpent, a snake. Not necessarily just a phallic representation, but a representation of wisdom, because the male priesthood was also guardian of sacred wisdom. In the ancient world, prayer was not like it is today. Prayer in the Hebrew is related to the word meaning to cut, as in to cut your skin. Prayer was a shamanic tantrum. Prayer was a raising of fierce psychic energy through various kinds of rituals and rites and self-deprivation and yelling, screaming. It was a psychic energy tantrum. In the ancient world, this is what aroused the powers of the gods and brought the attentions of the gods. Here is a photograph of a South American shaman doing this kind of prayer. It's fierce, raging, psychic energy.